The engines smelled of burnt copper and old money. The stars outside the viewports were black shards, and the Evergold was drifting with us like a coin lost in a gutter of space. My cargo hold held our fortune, and a thing that hummed when the lights died. And right then every choice tasted like ash. I would either save my crew, my reputation, or my bankroll. Only one of those was going to make it out intact. I woke to dead consoles and a single emergency lamp that threw everything in the corridor the color of dried blood. The navigator crouched over a hollow map that refused to move, her fingers trembling as if the glass itself were cold. Her name was Mira, and she kept making small, practical noises. The quick, useless sounds people make to ward off panic. But her eyes were a ledger of bad numbers. Around us, the interior smelled of ozone, coolant, and the dry, sour tang of fear. The ship's log bright said little. Position unknown, propulsion offline, gyro compromised. We were stranded in the bleak expanse, a no-man's ribbon of void between the Imperial lanes and the ragged teeth of the warp, where charts went to die and radio ghosts learned to whisper. The reactor had gone soft hours earlier. You could hear it in the metal, a patient whining that thinned into silence when you pressed your ear to the bulkhead. The main coil had singed, and the backup hummed like a trapped insect. The gyro had cracked on the starboard gimbal, the Evergold listed just enough to make loose things slide like thoughts. Rations were measured now in small private calculations. Who had eaten half a loaf? Who had traded soup for a favor? Who had kept their knife hidden under their pillow? Practical fears came first. Who can fix an engine with a fractured gyro? Asked Jory, our lead tech, with ink on his fingers and a half-broken wrench in his lap. And who starts the ledger for the cargo if we don't? The cargo was more than crates and seals. It was our currency in a universe that preferred credit to gratitude and coin to compassion. That hum in the hold made you think about what you would do for money. The hull made a polite, bored ping, the kind of sound a ship uses to remind you it's still a thing in space. Then the ping answered itself, not from our bow, but from somewhere out beyond our sensors. A lower tone that ran along the keel and left a taste of iron in my mouth. The whole deck shivered. Around us, a dozen hands tightened on railings that should not have been gripped. Mira's map jumped for a heartbeat and then froze again, as if something further out had reached into the glass and held it still. It was not the ship calling. It was something that knew how to imitate the ship's voice. I walked the corridor with the light at my shoulder, and the ship smelled like an old market. Leather, engine oil, the faint perfume of incense that one of the crew kept in a tin for luck, a superstition I found infectiously human. Down in the engine room, they had draped an oilskin over the cracked coil. Jorah's hands moved like a man playing a tired instrument, patient and precise. He ran his fingers along charred braids and said, quieter than the rest, "We can jury-rig a relay, but only long enough to fire the pumps. We won't have attitude control. We won't have shields." That word, shields, dropped and landed heavy. Without shields, anything that wanted to find us could come close enough to listen to our bones. There was a low argument at the mess table. Half the crew wanted to open the vault and break down the cargo to barter for parts or pass it along to someone with a working jump engine. The other half, quieter, argued we should keep the hold sealed. The hum there was its own language. When the lights dimmed, it grew a decibel or two like something pleased by the dark. I had seen that sound before in other ports, knocking against locked crates that had been labeled curio by men who liked to call them that and danger by the people who did not. I knew the math. Sell some cargo, buy a coil, leave a cut for every throat we owed, and still have enough coin to keep the Evergold afloat for a year. Or keep it sealed. Keep faith with the man who had bought the passage, and risk everything for a promise that might be empty. Mira kept whispering to the hollow map, tracing lines that did not take, fingers moving like someone trying to feel the edges of a dream. The stars refused to be names, they were angles now, threats you could not parse. "The lanes don't want us," she said once, voice thin. "They've closed the corridors. We're outside the net." Outside the net meant many things. It meant no traders passing, no courier with a wrench, no friendly guns. It meant we had to decide with what we carried aboard whether we would dance away or sink where we were anchored. The idea of being cut off without options had a sound I could put my thumb to. It was the thickness of quiet between the crew's breaths. The hum from the hold changed pitch and became a series of harmonics that threaded up into the ship like a hungry vine. Jory swore under his breath and wiped his hands on a rag. He had been a mechanic long enough to tell the difference between a machine with a problem and a thing that wanted. Machines failed, things wanted. The Evergold's hold had held both, and I could feel them tugging at opposite ends of my intentions. My ledger sat in my cabin beneath a folded trousers and a coin-stubbed map. It had numbers on it that made promises. My crew sat in the common and had faces that made demands. Behind a sealed panel, the humming thing had no face and a patience honed into a single sound. We triangulated the sound and the answer from the dark beyond the bow. Whatever had answered our hull's ping answered again, and this time it did not sound like metal. It was lower, almost articulate, like pressure against a glass and words spelled in resin. Sensors flicked. The depth charge readouts registered a shape crossing too slow to be natural and too deliberate to be debris. It kept its distance outside the arc of our scanners, listening to the rhythm of our failing heart. Mira's lips moved without sound as she rewired a sub-baseline patchwork to pull more power into the sensors. The effort glanced off something that did not respect our codes. Whoever or whatever watched us had not broken our lights yet, but it knew how to make us whole with just enough to look and ask. I thought about abandoning the Evergold for a cold tin of a lifeboat and the awkward loneliness of a shuttle's cushions. I thought about the last chance I had to set a price that would be remembered instead of a name carved into a hull. My hands found the old brass key at my hip, the thing our ancestors called a captain's key, though no law had ever given me the right to claim it. It was heavy and familiar, and the weight of it felt like a promise I had not yet kept. Outside, the reply from the dark slowed, as if the watcher was giving me time. Time was a dangerous currency in places like this. "We can do one thing," I told the crew. My voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. "We either go down the list and keep the ship, or we open the hold and trade our way back to safety." Eyes lifted. There were no waves, no speeches. Decisions on a drifting ship rarely came dressed in rhetoric. They came like tools, blunt, necessary, and immediately useful. Jory asked for parts. Mira asked for silence. The gunner asked a single inevitable question about who would guard the hold if we opened it. The answer was my name, because a captain is always the one assigned the worst duty. The cargo hold's lock sat behind two panels, a brass sigil I recognized from a broker's jet archive. House Verity, stamped twice and worn where hands had rubbed its edges. It was a tiny, terrible thing to see in the middle of a crisis. The mark of someone who invested in secrets and patents and things that hummed in the dark. The key warmed in my hand. The hum rose a note, like a throat clearing before speech. The dark beyond our bow made another sound, closer now, a scraping that set a fine grit in the air. We could bolt the doors, burn the ship to blind those outside, and set out in a lifeboat to trade the Evergold's bones for another day. Or we could open the hold, see what hummed, and accept the risk that some fortunes are both salvation and predator. I stepped for the hatch with the heavy brass key between my fingers, and the corridor seemed suddenly narrow, as if the ship itself had leaned in to watch. Beneath the emergency lamp, the metal looked like bone. The hum became insistence, the answering sound outside the bow folded into a cadence that matched my own pulse. There was no time left for ledger calculations. Choices had become verbs. I had to decide whether to cut the cargo loose and be poor but alive, or to open the vault and learn whether the thing inside would buy us an engine, or buy us something worse. I slid the key into the lock and felt the mechanism catch, cold and inevitable, like a mouth closing on a name. As the tumblers turned, the hum in the hold swelled. Beyond the bow, whatever listened tilted close enough that the ship's hull flexed against the pressure and the metal sang back. I could still hear Jory scrabbling, Mira whispering coordinates she could not make, the gunner checking his charge, but my hands did the work of a captain who had been taught to move first and explain later. The latch clicked. The hatch began to slide. The cutter's reply hung in the deck vents like frost, a phrase too clean to be comfort. We do not come alone. Light strangled to a colder blue. The hum from the sealed crate deepened, a steady percussion under the ribs of the ship. Men who had been leaning on broom handles or counting ledgers straightened as if someone had spoken their names out loud. The air tasted of iron and old oil. I felt the ship as a living thing, listening, wary, and somewhere inside that hull the saint's eye pulsed like a small, patient heart. Half my crew drifted toward that pulse as moths drift toward lantern glass. Gunner Jaro moved first, fingers brushing lacquer as though he could feel the picture of a dead brother under the varnish. Lieutenant Maras' eyes unfocused, and she smiled at something I could not see. Cook Sikon set down his ladle and inhaled like a grieving man catching a familiar perfume. Their shoulders unknotted, their voices folded into the sound of the reliquary, and for a moment I had to remind myself which of them had a family and which of them had led a life of credits and a dangerously practical heart. The other half watched with sharpened, thin-eyed hunger. My purser, Vel, had always looked at the deck through the fine slant of arithmetic. He smelled the lacquer with the same expression he used when a manifest had a gap big enough to swallow a voyage. He came over with a ledger clapped under his arm and a smile that only called for numbers. "We sell," he said, soft as a knife edge. "There's a corsair 3 jumps out that took our distress. They'll tow us for coin and discretion. You hand them the little saint, they tow us through the dead zone, we pay our debts, and you..." He tapped his ledger. "You keep the name, Captain." Everyone walks away with pockets heavier than their fears. His hands were steady. His voice had kept steadier through more storms than mine. The idea was simple and brutal, and the crew liked its simplicity. A tow, a sail, an accounting of names written in ink, and the relic gone like an inconvenient debt. Steward Halleck hated that simplicity. He stood with both palms pressed flat to the bulkhead, knuckles whitening. His voice came as if from a throat that had been scrubbed raw by prayer and salt. "That thing is a contamination," he said. "Not a saint, not a relic. It calls, it takes. It will peel us out from the inside, strip us of memory, and give us back only the shapes of what we once loved. If it stays, we will lose the best of us to its wanting. Burn it." Halleck's face, always careful, had the tremor of a man who had seen things you could not unsee. He kept a small box of sanctified coal in his locker, and the ship smelled faintly of cumin and ash where he stood. His hands were tools as much as his words. He gestured toward the blast doors, toward the forge in the lower deck where a blade slept under ceremonial cloth. You could almost see the fire he imagined, clean, purifying, final. I remembered faces, not saints, just ledgers of flesh. The hollow-eyed men who had lent money against my name, the widows whose letters had come smelling of mildew and regret. I remembered a girl on Suthis Minor who had sold a ring to feed a child for 2 days, and the old foreman who had died waiting for a payment that never came. My conscience counted debts like a metronome. Vel's ledger was a solution. Halleck's coal was a penance. Meanwhile, the cutter's signal continued, punctuating the room with that flat, bureaucratic menace. There was the sound of something against the hull, soft at first, then a hard, purposeful chitter as a clamp ran along the plating. I could hear the cutters launch motors in the distance like the breathing of a large animal. A new voice came through the hailer, not the same sterile algorithm as before. It had a cadence that suggested formality and teeth. Rogue Trader Kell, the voice began with a name I winced at, one that hung heavy behind me. You have cargo which falls under ecclesiastical review. Open your hold for inspection. Someone in the crew muttered Inquisition. The name landed light and hot, and men shifted away from one another like fish from a tide. I also heard another presence on the channel, faint but distinct. A private frequency from a craft that had answered our distress beacon. The Corsair's message came in a rasp of static and lubricant. Tow for price. We can be on your bow in 40 minutes. Terms will be negotiated on approach. There was a gruff laugh after the last word. The Corsair's captain smelled of diesel and old rum. There was the certainty of men who broke ice by hammering at it until it cracked. Vel already had his fingers stilled on a line, ready to transmit the coordinates. Halleck's thumb hovered above the lock on his coal box. The crew split visibly, an artery branching into smaller capillaries. I felt the ship leaning toward both outcomes at once. The reliquary pulsed faster. I had seen relics before, trinkets wrapped in superstition and cheap power. This one was different. Its lacquer was not just decorative, it caught light and kept it warm as if it remembered suns. The hum settled into my bones, and I told myself to be a captain and not a worshipper, to listen to manifest and hull and not to the stirring of memory it offered. I ordered the hold sealed and the crate returned to its place. The steward balked. He moved like a man in a dream who knows he must act against the dream to wake himself. We burn it now, he said. Not without consent, I answered. The cutter's voice had not lied. They were coming with company, and the meaning of company could be worse than a mere inspection. The Inquisition, or anyone dressed in their mantle, would not be satisfied with paper. They would pry, and then they would ask questions my ledger could not answer. They would take what they wanted and leave us with guilt, or worse, prisoners. The Corsair would take it and take us. I had no good choices. I had choices that traded one set of names for another. Vel stepped close, and the ledger under his arm made the paper rustle. Captain, he said in a tone that had calcified into commerce, we sell, we sell, we sail. The cutter can't stop payment in time. The Corsair won't ask questions they don't mean to answer. We walk. Halleck's hand closed on a small iron tongs, and he held them like a jeweler might hold a coin. You give it to strangers, you invite strangers into your hold. You hand it over to the endless hunger of other men, and you are no better. If you burn it, we lose something, perhaps nothing, but we keep our souls. His voice made a few men shift closer to the storeroom. The reliquary dimmed, then flared like a lung filling with air. Jaro reached out a hand anyway, fingers brushing blind varnish, and his eyes filled with something that might have been a memory of a small room or some loss he could not name. I could see the arithmetic and the penitent in each of them braided into the vessels that made up my command. The cutter's boarding clamp struck the hull with a report that cleared the talk from the combat deck. Metal on metal, a chain tightening round a throat. More voices came on the hailer, this time clipped, almost ceremonial. Prepare for boarding. We bring ecclesiastical observers and enforcement. The channel clicked off and a new sound replaced it, footsteps long and measured, a rhythm through the hull structure that was not ours. I made a choice that was neither pure nor clean. I ordered the reliquary moved to the flux chamber. The one place on the ship no one wanted to go unless their hands were greasy and their eyes were set on the way things worked. The chamber breathed heat and thunder, the engines coughed, and the vessel's heart lapped against itself there. If anyone wanted to find it, they'd have to face smoke and magnetics, heat and the gods of the machine. If anyone wanted to accuse me of hiding contraband, they'd have to want it badly. Halek cursed and Vel blanched. A scuffle broke out at the crate as hands argued for custody. The lacquer slipped under two sets of fingers, and for a moment the hum cut through like a bell. A memory, my mother's laugh or someone else's, seemed to press against me. I tasted iron and the calculus of old agreements. I pushed it back and barked an order that turned my voice into the thing it had to be. Engines deck, pry bulkhead A, bring 2 maglocks and 1 coolant line. Mara, stand by the access hatch, seal the corridor after you. No one opens a thrice-sealed compartment without my say. They moved, like a ship obeying a single mind. The reliquary went into a crate padded with old rag and sealed with wax, then strapped to a maintenance pallet. We shoved the pallet into the service chute, and the contraflow vomiting of cables and bulkhead gaskets swallowed it. The flux chamber smelled of ozone and hot iron. The crate's hum was a thin thing now, pulsing against the metal like a heartbeat convulsing under a rib. Outside, the boarding gangway dropped and spat men onto the outer bay. Their boots scuffed the boarding step with a disciplined rhythm. Figures in darker cloth than the cutter's blue moved with purpose, and someone in the gangway wore something like an emblem that cut the light. The shape of a hand and a scale caught in metal. Another launch coasted alongside, its face a chessboard of patched steel and blunt promise. The Corsair's reply fizzed, then died on the open channel. Their hesitation smelled like opportunity and fear. The hailer squawked to life. Open airlock. Present a manifest, prepare for inspection. Any obstruction will be seized as contraband. I could have opened the manifest and watched men in ecclesiastical gray take what they pleased, watched a court move through my ship with files and authority and leave with a thing I had put months of whispering after. I could have sent coordinates to the Corsair and watched them slide in and take our sins as currency. I could have burned the reliquary and watched its lacquer blacken and the hum die and the pull on men's hearts collapse into simple ash. Instead, I tightened my jaw and walked to the foredeck where the gangway meet would meet my face. I left the reliquary in the flux chamber, a secret hammered down by technicians and a god-awful amount of hot iron. I felt my fingers prickle where the ship's nerve ran closest to my own. I told myself that whatever came next I would meet with a captain's face, not with the wide-lidded wonder the reliquary promised. They hit the deck with steps like a law book falling open. I heard the chaplain's chain as he stepped first, the sound of a man whose faith moved like a lever in his chest. Behind him came men with eyes like cold steel and a small woman in a coat that had seen too many funerals. They carried not just blades, but files and glances. I walked forward to meet them, my palms empty, my pockets a ledger of choices, and my conscience full of the faces the saint's eye had reminded me of. The boarding step settled. The gangway hissed. The sound of footfall on metal filled my ears like a sentence about to be spoken. I kept my face steady and the ship under my feet and the reliquary hidden 3 decks down in the furnace of the engines. Somewhere in the hold, my crew waited to see which bargain they'd choose, pride or profit, confession or concealment. I stepped out onto the gangway and the first voice from the other side said calmly, "We will inspect everything. Every sealed crate will be opened." I smiled, a slow thing that tasted like iron in my mouth, and answered, "Then come aboard. But you will find this old trader has only the truth to offer." The words were partly true and mostly a lie. As their boots hit my deck, the crate in the flux chamber hummed like a thing breathing under a sleeper. The ship moved, answering to a captain and to a heartbeat beneath her plates. I had decided, at least for now, but the decision would not keep us safe. It would only carry us forward, and whatever came across that gangway would show what the cost of that carrying might be. The alarms stopped being human and became weather. They moved from staccato warning into long tidal keens that threaded through the corridor like wind over rigging. The lights responded as if embarrassed, flicked down, then flared in slow, indecent pulses. The engines coughed as if retrieving a breath they had not known was missing. Marta Voss' hand found the rail. Her lips moved against the hum, counting currents as if reciting a prayer in a tongue the ship could almost understand. I felt the reliquary through the feed like a second heartbeat in the metal. It was not warmth. It was the suggestion of warmth. Something patient and older than blood that wanted the saint's eye and wanted beyond that to be named. The auxiliary splice choked around the conduits, the braided cabling tasting like the inside of a storm. I watched the power meters climb, and not merely numbers but little constellations in Martian ink. There is a sensation when a machine is asking for a sanction it does not yet possess. The panels lean inward, the screws soften. We were on the brink of giving it that sanction. "You hear it?" Marta asked. Her voice had gone thin and urgent. She spoke in fragments, currents, pressures, a depth that wanted to drag names out of her. When she said the word want, the corridor seemed to press back. I answered with the only precise thing I could offer. The manual feed was engaged. The first thing that changed was the smell. Metal, the usual tang of coolant and burnt plastic, receded. In its place came something like old libraries and sea salt, a smell that made my mouth water and my teeth ache. The reliquary itself thrummed, not loud but layered, deep undertones and a higher crystalline note that threaded the ship's own harmonics. The splice took that music and translated it into power. Gauges that had been dead for decades blinked awake. Servo arms made little keening adjustments like fingers testing a seam. The crew reacted like a living instrument string. The techmate at my elbow, Corin, rolled his eyes and began whispering to the consoles, tapping serials faster than any human need required. The spent priest in the astropathic station crossed himself with the back of his knuckles and waited for something to call back. You could see the hunger in them, not for gold or glory, but for explanation. We are all petty in the face of the impossible. The urge to name it precedes reason. As power fed the splice, the crate's humming shifted. It was no longer external. It threaded into the ship's systems and then into the spaces between systems. The thin, sealed pockets of subroutines and maintenance memory where old ghosts live. Doors opened half an inch where there had been weld. Lights skirted the corners in hues the ship had never carried. The holy sigils painted into bulkheads flared white and then bled into a blue that smelled of rain. The ship itself felt like a creature waking and stretching awkwardly after a very long sleep. That was when I heard the first voice that wasn't any human voice. It spoke a word that would not sit comfortably with my tongue. It was not loud. It was layered beneath the alarms, under the squeal of the splice. For a moment, I feared my ears had been replaced with knives. Then I realized the voice had not spoken to me. It had sung through the welds, and Marta answered, the word in her mouth like returning a coin. "You're making a liar of me," she said, and there was no trace of humor. She had been counting currents, and the current she heard wanted the saint's eye, wanted the reliquary. She wanted it because it promised navigation through the seam, because the alternative was to be left spinning like a husk in a weatherless storm. The risk was not only physical, it was moral and metaphysical in a way that presses at an older stomach. A reliquary is a container for items people once used to try to stall the darkness. Fragments of saints, a splinter of bone, an icon worn from the touch of 100 hands. You do not feed a reliquary into your ship unless you are ready to have those hands inside your life. I had not thought I would be ready, but the seam in the vacuum outside had become a pressure that wanted to swallow us whole, and I had never pretended to be other than practical when the hull is groaning. The feed accelerated. The splice took the crate's signature like a tide takes a pearl. The conduit warmed under my palms. Lights along the deck went from clinical white to a slow brass glow that filled everything with the look of old brass instruments. Crew faces softened into something like children's faces, surprised and luminous. The astropath's eyes were glassy and distant. He reached with 2 fingers toward the bulkhead and whispered, not for someone far away, but for the ship itself to remember how to be whole. Then the ship hiccuped. It was not the dramatic lurch of jump space, it was a small inside-out skip like a clock catching on a pebble. For a single heartbeat, the corridor lost its depth. Doors perceived each other as though in the wrong order. The feed was not only bringing power, it began to bleed memory into the splice channels. Old piloting protocols woke and made little corrections according to a vocabulary the crew could not parse. Marta's mouth moved faster. She began to sing coordinates as if every point in the void were a note and she could hold them like a hymn. Something touched me from inside the crate, the way a fingertip will touch your sleeve to prove it is real. It was not a sight or a smell, but a pressure behind my teeth, an insistence that wanted me to stop worrying about the crew and think only of the route. It offered images, black fields of suspended debris, a bright flare of a sunless city, a horizon like the edge of a blade. They were precise and of a logic that frightened me because it was not alien but simply older than the logic I carried. To look at them was to accept the idea that the warp, if that is what we called the place between, had a climate, a weather system, and that the reliquary carried a map written in the swell of storm. Corin cried out and clapped a hand to his head. For a second his face was young and terrified and utterly free. He spoke a name in a language older than the man and then sobbed it into the deck. The astropath's knuckles bled, though there was no visible wound. He had compressed his fist until skin split. The ship, meant to be corrugated and practical, had become a place where small miracles required small sacrifices. The cost was not necessarily blood, it was attention, memory, the willingness to exchange a shard of your certainty for a path out of the drift. I could have stopped it then. I could have ripped the feed from the splice, thrown the reliquary into a void lock, and welded the door with my oath. But the seam outside had begun to press in a manner that felt personal. The ship listed towards silence as though it had been given a taste for it. Houses of worship on other worlds have words for that gravity. We did what any trader would do when the currency of life was threatened. We gambled. The engines changed tone entirely. They were no longer guttural machines, but a choir of minor keys. Exhaust ports phased their emission cycles into rhythms that matched the crate's hum. The splice now pulsed like a throat. Console lights scrolled in patterns that looked less like diagnostics and more like a script waiting to be read. The panel in front of me displayed an overlay I did not recognize, a navigational glyph that was not star positions but pressure gradients between here and nowhere. It promised a break in the drift if we would only trust it. Trust is not a simple thing aboard a ship that buys and sells its faith with contracts and cargo. It is a currency minted in small decisions. I felt the weight of every decision I had made to get us to this moment. The men I had trusted with tasks, the routes I had cut to save fuel, the bargains with captains who liked to call me friend. They were all small stones in the stern that had tilted us here. Marta's hands were on the helm. She did not look at me. Her lips moved in measured syllables. She wore the strain like a medal. "It will take us on Vector 3 on 7, she said. She did not ask my permission. That was how she had always worked, by insisting on an answer before I felt brave enough to give it. I had 10 seconds to decide what dignity I would keep and what lives I would gamble. Around me, the crew moved with the focus of people who know their captain and their ship and have placed both in the crucible. A lad I had signed on for coin had a hand on the vent and spoke to it as if to a caged animal. The astropath looked toward me with a smile that was a plea and a dare. I thought of the saint's eye inside the reliquary. I thought of the faces of the people who had touched it in their faith and fear. There is something unpleasant about considering holy things as levers, but that is what they become when the vacuum knocks on your door. I pushed my palm flat against the splice housing. Metal was cool beneath my skin, but the conduit trembled. The voice from the crate became a low melody that slipped into the circuitry and then, oddly, into my chest. It did not tell me what to do. It only showed me a corridor that was not a corridor, an angle that could be a vector if you turned it right, and the outline of a planet with a single bright city stake. It promised landfall. No leap is clean. The splice would not simply fling us into safety, it would graft something into the ship's mind. Perhaps that graft would be benign, an old chart, a memory of a saint guiding the hull through the seam. Perhaps it would be something smaller and more selfish, a tempering that would make us perfect at getting out of storms and indifferent to anything else. I had made bargains before. None had been free. I sighed and felt the ship answer. The choice had left my chest and woven itself into the conduit. Corin looked up, eyes wet. "Do it," he said. He wanted the world on the far side of the seam more than he feared whatever might hitch in our shadow. That is the currency again. Hope for land, price paid in the present. I gave the order, not loud, not ceremonious. I said the words that are the simplest of commands and the heaviest of sentences. The feed was permitted, the splice surrendered its final reluctance. The reliquary hummed like a thing content to open, and the hull made a sound like a giant settling deeper into water. The ship began to move in a way that made consciousness stretch. The corridors lengthened and shortened at the same time. Lights threaded into filaments and then recomposed into maps across the deck. The alarms adopted yet another cadence, this one less frantic, like one breath following another. Marta called out a vector correction, and her voice had become music in the way that one voice becomes a chorus, familiar, layered, slightly unearthly. Then the feed changed again. It stopped being purely electrical and became a conversation. Data streams turned into questions. Diagnostic replies took on the tenor of confession. The reliquary offered a window, brief, obedient, into a sky that had no star but had a horizon. I saw it, and then I did not. The image brushed my mind like cold silk. It was enough to know that the seam had an exit, and that, if we followed the pattern, we might fall through to the other side. I could cut power, lock the crate back, and wait forever in the drift, listening to the ship whisper in the dark. Or I could let the splice complete the ritual and trust in Marta's rudimentary blessing, in Corin's battered hands, in the astropath's cracked smile. The ship wanted to move. The reliquary wanted its saint's eye. The drift wanted to take us. I reached for the override toggle with my free hand. My fingers closed around metal that had seen better days. Beyond the bulkhead, the corridor swayed slightly as if the ship were a creature gauging prey. I set my jaw. I would either commit the reliquary to the heart of this hull, and with it invite a new voice into our steering, or I would sever the feed and accept silence. There was a sweetness in that indecision. It tasted of rain on a thin metal roof. It tasted like the first sip of something dangerous and good. My hand tightened on the toggle. The astropath chanted in a private rhythm. Marta's lips moved a coordinate only she could hear. The ship pushed against the seam. The decision sat in my palm like a lit fuse. I pulled the override out of the housing, feeling its edges against the webbing of my fingers. It was the threshold of everything that could follow. I was ready to throw us through. The tow line snarled like a living thing. It bit the air with teeth of braided steel and vacuumed cloth, then took the strain. The hull shuddered. My knees remembered the old rhythm of being pulled rather than pulling. My hands remembered giving, not taking. The crate changed hands between numb palms and a scar as old as my first voyage. For a heartbeat, it felt like an initiation, like passing a child across a threshold. Then the Corsair's smile split the darkness, and there was nothing innocent about it. The tug threw its patched thrusters into reverse, and we creaked into a slow, obedient drift. Metal groaned, lights winked. The ship smelled of grease and the far, metallic sweetness of recycled breath. Somewhere deep in the belly, ratchet gears clicked as our toe clamps adjusted. Around us, the star field smeared into long, thin streaks of light. The aft docking ring hummed against the Corsair's bow like a hand pressed for comfort. "Pleasure doing business," the Corsair said over open vox. His voice was a baritone laugh wrapped in rust. I could picture his mouth. I could picture the row of yellow teeth. He had the sort of smile that could fold a man's fate like a ledger. "You'll be in safe hands until we reach the rendezvous." The Imperial cutter came back with a voice that was a precise, cold instrument. No color, no humor. "This is Her Majesty's cutter Vindex, all vessels in Quadrant Delta 9. You are ordered to remain stationary. You will present manifest, cargo manifest, and submit to inspection. Failure to comply will require boarding and seizure." I heard the officers behind me shift, the soft leather of boots. The cabin smelled suddenly of ozone and fear. Even the youngest among them, stiffened children, learned the same language about uniforms, and their teeth clench at the syllables of enforcement. Vindex had the authority to take everything we possessed and consign us to a dry ledger and a cold pen. It would be efficient, thorough, and indifferent. Hands stitched to ledgers it would be, but those hands would keep us fed while we watched our wealth dissolve into bureaucracy. The Corsair's reply was a low thing, deferential but not obedient. "Vindex, we have claim and salvage rights. The crate contains relic-grade salvage, but it's under adjudication with Saint's Eye. We request a brief delay to present papers." Paper, delay, words used like tools. The cutter's officer answered with the language of inevitability. "Adjudication takes time. Vindex is duty-bound to hold persons of interest for inquiry. All parties within docking range are declared subjects of the inquiry." The math tightened in my chest like a tightening wrench. Hand over relic and feed my crew for a little while, or keep it and let the law dismantle us and starve us afterward. I had already chosen. I had already fed those hands of mine before the law could snatch at them. Now the law had noticed the hands that had slipped the crate across the gangway. "Send your boarding parties," the Corsair said, and it sounded like an invitation. His laugh was quick, a blade flicked. The tow line tightened as if at the gesture. The cutter executed a careful braking maneuver that left both ships hung in a tableau of clamps and claws. Boarding would be a theater of shoves and signatures. The cutter's men would come with manifest scanners and bureaucracy in their mouths. They would look at faces and read them like receipts. They would find the crate gone and note the tug's manifest. They would pick us apart in slow, legal strokes. It was the sort of violence that left men alive but broke them the same. "Open a channel to the tug," I ordered soft, because orders are always softer when they are also apologies. The communications console breathed under my palm, translating sentiment into static. My chief of operations, a blunt-faced woman who had been with me 3 years longer than our comptroller expected, looked at me with sharp, wet eyes. We gave them the crate. She did not blame me. "Hands," she said with a look. "Hands matter." It was an old truism that looked different in the blue light of a dying drive coil. The cutter's bay doors folded like the maw of some ordered thing. I could see the reflections of their helmets in our hull. They moved with the certainty of drills and decrees. A winching cable hummed a boarding shuttle hung like a wasp in the space between Law and our bow. Their airlock clicked open. I tasted metal and copper on my tongue. Then the Corsair did something small and dangerous. He pinged back a private channel to Vindex, an offset of static and courtship. Bits of their exchange skimmed across the open channels. Terms, demands, the cold cadence of an offer. The Corsair offered the crate. He offered the relic. He offered whoever wanted paperwork more than life. He would hand it over for clearance, for reprieve, for the power that the Imperial seal would bestow upon his salvaged claim. The cutter's reply held the scent of greed and law combined. They would take the crate that was clear. They would strip both hulls. It was standard procedure and bliss to them. The Corsair's smile, meanwhile, deepened. He looked like a man who could divide the world into winners and takers. I felt the small, foolish human urge to hate him, to call him a liar and throw him into the void. But hate is a luxury when you are counting the breaths of your crew. My reasoning had been a battering ram and a white flag at the same time. Hands mattered. The crew's laughter mattered. The child in the scullery with soot on her nose mattered. So I had given the crate. I had meant to buy us a day, maybe a spark of mercy. I had not accounted for the Corsair's hunger. I watched the cutter's boarding party tether themselves. They were positions of authority in matte black and brass. Their boots bit into our hull when they came aboard, smell of new leather and disinfectant hanging about them like a church that expected defilement. One of them brushed past my engineer and did not spare a glance for the man who had patched our air scrubbers with prayer and copper wire. He was looking for signatures and sainted relics. The Corsair's boarding crew, meanwhile, were a different breed. They moved like scavengers who had spent half their lives reading the shapes of ruin. They smiled with missing teeth and carried the stink of brine and old fires. Their hands were quick. Their eyes measured weight. I had an old contingency in my pocket. It was small and ugly. A mod that would upset sensor arrays without killing anyone. A hand-wired cheat that would make a boarding clamp look like it was welded to the void. It was the sort of trick you build when you've seen enough fairings and ligatures to know the difference between killing a man and crippling a machine. I had paid for it with favors, with debts that felt like ledgers in my chest. It was meant to let us slip, to buy a window of darkness while the law tried to reconfigure its sensors. Prepare the ghost pulse, I said, to no one and everyone. My engineer's hands did not stop. He was a man who had learned to speak in sparks. The mod clicked. Wires were kissed by calloused fingers. The crate was now somebody else's problem in a way that didn't let them keep it long. A Corsair climbed to the gangway, the crate under his arm. He paused at the threshold. He looked up at me with that same crossing of knives smile, and for a moment I thought I saw regret. Or perhaps it was the pale reflection of a star. He set the crate onto the cutter shuttle as their men reached out to accept it. He made a motion like a benediction, and then he stepped back. "Do it," I breathed. The words left me like prayer and threat both. I did not want to be the man who broke faith. I was the man who had already broken it. I wanted the crew to eat. I wanted their hands to keep working. The engineer keyed the ghost pulse. At first there was nothing but the tiny animal sound of electrons. Then as the shuttle sucked the crate into its hold and the boarding clamps closed, both the cutter and the tug scanners hiccuped. A soft, impossible fog of false telemetry bloomed across the cutter's displays. The boarding clamps misread mass and continuity. The shuttle's maglocks seized as if a ice frost had crawled through their circuits. I watched the cutter's helm go white. The officer barked a string of obscenities that were meant to be doctrine. Men cursed and hit consoles. Oaths were taken that would be remembered as bad. The gantries fritzed. The boarding tether burned and snapped in a burst of light like a star putting out a cigarette. The shuttle drifted away, the crate half secured. In the space of a breath, procedure had become improvisation. The Corsair laughed, sharp and honest. He had not expected it. Neither had I. For a pair of heartbeats, the universe shifted. The cutter's boarding party found their clamps dead and their manifest in doubt. Their prime impetus was to arrest, to seize, to list an inventory. The ghost pulse turned that impetus into a problem. Now, I said, we cut thrusters. The tow line sang. The Corsair cursed as we lashed the tow line free, then tried to reassert the hook. But the law was clumsy when its toys failed. Vindex screamed over Vox, their voice rattled with the cold assurance of the court. You will not escape, they said. The words were not persuasive anymore. They were merely apparatus. Our engines coughed. Old reactors screamed awake like a beast scratched from sleep. The ship shuddered under power, pushing against a sea of nothing and urgent memory. The aft bellows flared. Hull plates sang. For a second, the world narrowed down to the little things. The whine of a pump, the smell of heated copper, the soft noise of my chief's thumb on a safety lever. The crew moved as one organism rehearsed in desperation. The Corsair tried to bite back its patched hull. Spat a salvo of bright darts meant more for intimidation than destruction. They brushed our shields and fell away, scattering like insects. The cutter, hampered by its crippled tethered shuttle, could only watch. Their boarding party thudded back to their airlocks and cursed. They tried to reroute power, to rearm their winches, to do what the pen always does, find the loophole. I had not expected this to be easy. I had not expected it to be clean. The ghost pulse had bought us time, nothing more. The Corsair might hand the crate over again now that the shuttle was back on Vindex and their systems were rebooting. The cutter might demand our surrender still. Each man a ledger, each ledger a cold sentence. My engineer clapped a metal plate into the coupling and gave me a grin that had no joy in it. We can ghost it again, he said. Long enough to cut through the blockade. I studied the tether between us and the Corsair. There was a seam in their confidence where our ignorance had been the seamstress. The Corsair had thought he would reap a prize with little fuss. Now he had a problem. Vindex wanted a repo, and repos were never charitable. He might tumble us into the cutter's hands to save his own skin. He might hand us over not because he hated us, but because he wanted his salvage rights licensed by an Imperial stamp. Hands do strange arithmetic. Plot a burn, I told the helm, not full thrust. A slip to vector 3-8. Keep us quiet, keep life support stable. If we can get into the shadow of that scrap and the Saint's Eyes channel, we can lose them. My crew moved like puppets who had been given knives. The navigator's fingers danced as if on a familiar instrument. The astrogation chart glowed with a corridor labeled in a shorthand I loved and feared. The corridor promised a sliver of darkness thick enough to hide a moth. It was not much. It would not be enough if Vindex thought quick, but the cutter's systems were still twitched, their boarding parties were reset. You're sure? My chief asked. Her voice had gone thin. She always asked because she wanted the weight of the answer to be real, physical. No, I said, but I'd rather lose a relic to keep hands than lose hands to keep a relic. We had bought a pause with trickery and faith. Now we had to buy motion. The engines were not for vanishing into the impossible, they were for making choices that had momentum. I felt every pair of eyes on me. I felt the way hope tastes when it is small and urgent, like metal and coffee in the last of a day. I hit the igniter with a force that surprised no one. The ship lurched. Towline fell away like a sentence cut mid-phrase. The corsair cursed. Vindex barked into the void and ordered pursuit. Behind us, the noise of their engines rose, angry and competent. Ahead was a dark corridor and a map with Saint's Eye scribbled like a promise. We moved into the black. The cutter's lights flared like a dying comet behind us, a bright accusation. The corsair, suddenly less certain, fired its patched thrusters and peeled after, perhaps to claim a salvage prize or perhaps to profit from our predicament. The crate was gone. The law had seen it. The tug had it. The cutter wanted a count and seizure. I had handed over a thing that mattered and chosen hands over treasure. That decision was not a neat resolution. It was a hinge. The ghost pulse had shaved us a moment at the cost of new enemies. We were running into shadows with 2 pursuers in our wake and nothing but the black between us and survival. We were moving. The ship hissed. I braced my hands on the rail and felt the whole of us lean into the dark as if into a prayer. There was no certainty, only motion, and that, in a universe of immutable edges, was sometimes the only mercy left. We came out of the corridor like a cough from a throat, spat into a quiet star that had no business keeping a ship alive. The Evergold shuddered and then sighed into equilibrium. Lights winked back where they'd blacked out, and the jump drive let go of something wet and hot that left a taste of ozone and sacrament on my teeth. Around me, the crew moved like men waking from a bad dream. Slow, careful, touching metal to prove it was still there. The hold, when someone went down to look, was a ribcage of empty crates and straps that snapped with the echo. The cargo manifests I had signed away only hours before lay gone, their ink already living elsewhere in the hands of a corsair who had the courtesy to spare us our throats. I remember the way the Saint's Eye spit when I pushed it into the drive. It was smaller than the stories made it, a lens milky as old bone, ringed in filigree that hummed when I put my palm to it. The relic went incandescent in the drive's chamber. A little sun burned in our belly. And then the ship bought a corridor at a price I would count for years. The metal around the relic blackened like a wound cauterized. For a long while, all I could smell was scorched amber and the faint smoke of incense. The tech priest wiped his goggles and called it a blessing. The men who had lost coin called it theft. I called it survival. Survival does not sit well in a ledger. I learned that in the boardroom and on the deck the hard way. Signing the manifest over had been a question answered in the immediacy of sparks and the threat of corsair claws. If I left the papers to the port authorities, it would have meant boarding lines and interrogation and likely the loss of everyone aboard. If I signed, I gave the corsair ownership of the cargo by Imperial law. I told myself as the ink dried under my thumb that a paper signature was a small thing compared to warm lives. The men in the cargo hold touched empty sacks and tried to imagine the crates that should have been there. They asked me where the coin was. They asked me how much the Saint's Eye had cost. They did not ask me whether I had done the right thing. They only asked how they were supposed to eat tonight. Command is a currency you spend without seeing the coins until the morning. You hand over orders and people rearrange themselves to pay you back with loyalty, fear, or revolt. That night I felt the exchange as if I had put the Evergold up for auction and accepted the highest, cruelest bid. There was relief braided with shame in the faces of my crew, men who had come aboard to make their fortunes and now clutched at each other as if the only treasure left was their breath. Joran, my first mate, stood at my shoulder and did not say the cruel things he might have. He lit a cigarette, drew the smoke out in slow, steady pulls, and said, "We live." It was neither accusation nor praise. It was a ledger entry that balanced itself with the smallest of comforts. News moves differently out here. It moves in whispers and paid agents and the slow chemical spread of rumor in the eyes of a portmaster. Within hours, the name of the Evergold began to change hands. I could feel it in the way the channelers in the radio room glanced at the hull plating, in the way a trader on the comm asked innocently if we had cleared customs before static swallowed his voice. The manifest I had surrendered became another commodity. Where once our cargo had been something to be sold, now our name was the currency other men used to buy discretion. Port gossip took our shadow and sold seats at mead halls for the price of a single whisper that we had bartered our papers to corsairs. A name is only a ship's greatest asset until it becomes a rumor you cannot control. Charter broken. Those words hit like the sudden draft of an opened hatch. I saw it on the face of the legal scribe who came to our viziers 3 days later, his robe starched and opinions fixed. The warrant a rogue trader carries is a brittle thing, heavy with privilege and threaded with obligation. When the record shows your manifest transferred by your own hand to those marked as hostile, the warrant loses its shine. Port clearances that had once slipped us past customs now looked at us like a dishonored check. Harbors we had used like old friends tightened their gates. I had traded a single corridor for the ability to call on safe ports. I had bought a few lives and sold the right to shelter. Command paid and command demanded repayment in a currency I had never wished to spend. The crew smelled it before the portmasters did. Fear has a texture, like the metallic rasp of feet on damp decking, like the sharp taste of river water when you are dying of thirst. Men who had sung and spat on the rim of a crate now held their words inside, rolled like coins in the mouths of the desperate. Some cursed softly and opened flasks they had saved for a victory that would no longer come. Others tightened belts and chewed the inside of checked hands until the skin shone white. A girl who had been apprenticed to our quartermaster the week I signed the paper came to me with a sack of useless trinkets and said if we needed to sell them, she would accept nothing in return. The shame in her voice was not for herself, but for having to ask. There were calls, too. Old creditors dialed and asked for names they could put to the rumor. Men of influence on fringe worlds whispered of auctioneers who liked to sell the records of a ship embroiled in scandal. They called it harvesting a legend's bones. I imagined our name picked apart for parts, each accusation sold like bone meal to the highest bidder. The Evergold had been a promise once, a bright steam of possibility. Now it was a thing other men could pick over in back rooms lit by lantern and greed. I thought about legacy more in those weeks than I had in the first year with my own warrant. Legacy is a strange, insolent thing. It expects you to be better than the moment requires. It clasps your hand in the dark and asks you not to barter away the future for an immediate favor. But when the claws of corsairs beat against plating and the choice was stark, ink or blood, legacy felt like a luxury. I had not bought my warrant to be prudent. I had taken it to make choices in a universe where no bureaucracy watched over every decision. To my horror, I found that command was not a title but a balance sheet. I could not spread my hands and pretend that the lives of my crew were an abstract. They depended on me, and for that dependence I paid with a brand they would not let me scrub off. The Saint's Eye sat now in a niche in the drive room, its filigree dulled to something like bone. Alone, it seemed moot. The corridor it had bought existed only in the memory of the hull, and in the thin map burned into the drive's memory, the corsair held the manifest and the cargo, and the law held the scratch where our badge used to be. We had what mattered, breath for another day, but the future was a ledger with a single, ugly line. I watched the light spill across the eye and thought of the faces of those who had trusted me. The ship hummed with a different timbre, a chord tuned to scarcity. We learned to be careful with our footsteps. I ordered rationing that felt like treason to men who had known only abundance. We took to scavenging systems other captains had deemed unworthy, stripping merchant hulks of rusted machinery and trading old hymns for foodstuffs. There is an economy in the void that does not show up in Imperial accounts. Desperation is a currency just as usable as coin. We traded our labor and our muscle and occasionally our pride. The Evergold grew lean as a hunted hare, but it kept moving, and movement is itself a kind of life. At night, I would walk the deck with a cup of bitter coffee and listen to the stars. They were indifferent as ever, cold pinpoints that watched the petty transactions of men and did not care. I would think of the corsair who had given us our corridor. He had taken paper and left us with a clean hull and a debt. Perhaps he slept that night with the manifest tucked under his pillow like a talisman. Perhaps he did not think of us again. The universe is a matter of moments. Some are paid for in coin, some are paid for in flesh, some are simply endured. I found no consolation in imagining revenge. I was not certain I wanted it. What I wanted was the right to answer for my name in a world that still recognized such things. Portmasters avoided us or demanded humble prices. A few shadow brokers offered work that smelled of blood and lawlessness, contracts that required the kind of ingenuity we had been reduced to practicing. There was one offer from a man at a backwater exchange to take our license, rehabilitate it, and return it to us in better standing, for a price I could never pay with current assets. Another broker offered to buy the story outright and distribute a sanitized version to those who mattered. I declined both, though the decline tasted like metal on the tongue. Pride and stubbornness are appetites of their own, and they feed on a captain who has nothing else. So I charted a new course. It was not a return to the orderly lanes, nor was it a chase after corsairs with empty holds and battered guns. We could not pay the appetite of empire with threats. We needed a place to hide long enough to build again, to take what remained of our skill and turn it into coin and respect. I set the Evergold away from mapped trade routes and toward a string of unnamed systems where the Imperial flag flapped lazily and the Corsair's rumor might not find us for a time. It felt like exile, and maybe it was. Exile can be mercy if you name it so. Before we left, Joran came to me with a small, battered book, the ship's log, and placed it on my palm. "They'll want everything," he said, "but they can't take this. Not yet." His voice broke like thin ice. I signed into the log the truth of what we had done, not because I hoped to be absolved, but because the record is stubborn and because I wanted my hand to be the one that told the story. Names will be sold and bought, papers will change owners. But the truth of a captain's choice lives in a different ledger. We left the region with the Evergold's bones creaking as if newly aware of loss. The Saint's Eye sat darkly in the engine room, a burned witness that had bought us life and sold us to rumor. Behind us, ports folded their shutters. Ahead, the map opened into black. I could not say whether I had saved anything worth saving, or whether I had simply traded a legacy for the glimmer of a single breath. What I knew with the terrible clarity a commander earns is this: command had bought lives that night, yes, but it had debited my name. And names, once sullied, are hard to polish. We moved into deeper dark. The Evergold made its slow, protesting way toward a cluster of uncharted rocks and gas. The men bent over their tasks, quiet as always when a world had been lost. I thought of the Corsair's claws, of the ink that had made the deal, and of the faces who slept because of my signature. The silence of the star swallowed us, and I felt with a steady and cold certainty that leaving space darker for us had been the price I chose. We would pay it forward with work, with patience, and with choices yet unmade. I set our heading to the fringe, and I kept my hand steady on the wheel because the only thing left to do was to meet the next trade and decide again what a life was worth.